My name is Daniel Lehmann. I'm the president here at Hebrew College, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this conversation that's going to take place between myself and Professor Rabbi Arthur Green, and hopefully many of you will join in and participate in this conversation as well. Last year, we initiated a series of public conversations called People of the New Book, in which authors of new books of Jewish interest were invited here to Hebrew College throughout the year to have public conversations about their books and the implications of their writing for the Jewish community. Art Green's new book, Radical Judaism, came out in the spring of last year, and we decided that instead of having this public conversation about Art's book then in the crowded part of the end of the academic year cycle, we would actually wait until the beginning of this year and use it to inaugurate Hebrew College's public events for this 2010-2011 academic year. So we've waited, and the time has finally come, and I'm very, very pleased that so many of you have chosen to join us this evening. Just a few words of introduction, and then we'll get started. As many of you know, Professor Art Green is a renowned scholar of Jewish mysticism and Hasidic thought, really one of the world's great experts and writers and interpreters of Jewish mysticism and Hasidut. He's taught at the University of Pennsylvania. He served as president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. He's taught at Brandeis University most recently. And since coming to Hebrew College, has been the founding dean and now rector of our rabbinical school, of which he and all of us at Hebrew College are so proud because of its development and the impact that it's having both locally and throughout the country and around the world. In addition to being an important scholar, thinker, theologian, what I think is important to note this evening, because of the Hebrew College setting, is the extent to which Art is really a model of what Hebrew College really stands for. And by that I mean the intersection of rigorous and serious academic study of Judaism and the Jewish community, bridging what is often a very serious and deep chasm between the academy and the lives of Jews, both as individuals and as communities. And this nexus between higher Jewish learning and the Jewish challenges and issues and opportunities that we confront living as Jews in this contemporary world is really at the heart of Art's work, and in many ways embodies exactly what Hebrew College is all about. The serious, intense, focused study of Judaism and its sources, and how we interpret them and bring them to life within the Jewish community. And Art has served in important settings throughout the country as a public intellectual, as someone who cares deeply about Judaism, Jewish education, the Jewish world, and humanity writ large. And we're going to get to that in this conversation as well, because it's a central theme of his book. And he has brought that incredible charisma and presence and intensity to the work here at Hebrew College. And I have to say, on a personal note, I've been here now for a little over 2 years, and it has been an incredible joy for me personally to be able to work alongside Art, to study with him, to daven with him. And I've learned a great deal. I've been inspired, and I continue to grow as a Jew and as a human being in relationship to the ideas and the provocative thinking that Art brings to the Jewish world and to the world of those people thinking seriously about religious life in the 21st century. So it's a thrill to participate in this public conversation with him. We have many conversations throughout the week, but this allows us to share some of those thoughts and ideas with you. Just a word on the format. I'm going to start the conversation with Art through a series of questions and hopefully dialogue about themes in his book, and I'm going to organize my questions to go through some of the central motifs of his book, so those of you who haven't had a chance to read it will have some sense of the way the book is structured and some of the critical ideas that he raises. Obviously, I'll only touch on some of them. After we've had that conversation for a bit, I will then open it up. And because I work so closely with Art, I'm not going to be able to throw all of the hardballs that I might otherwise, because we have to learn, live, and daven with each other regularly. But I do invite you, if you have any hardballs to throw, not to feel the same constraint that I feel, and we do want it to be a civil, but we want it to be a lively conversation. So please, I really do want participation, and we want it to be truly a public conversation and not just a performance. I request that you keep your questions succinct. I'm not a great model for that, but I'm going to do my best this evening. But if we all try hard, I think we'll enable as many people as possible to participate. We'll end on time, and I hope it will be a really stimulating, enjoyable evening for everybody. And again, thank you all for coming, and welcome to Hebrew College. So the book that we're going to discuss tonight, which again appeared this past spring, Radical Judaism, Rethinking God and Tradition, which is available as are other books by Professor Green outside. This is a book which is structured on a very famous triad. I mean, we are talking about radical Judaism. So, and the triad is God, Torah, and Israel. And in fact, there is a very oft-quoted statement that God, Torah, and Israel are one. And as Art points out in a footnote in the book, while many think that that's a very, very ancient statement, contemporary scholarship has actually pointed out that that phrase, in the particular way that it's most frequently quoted, probably has its earliest formulation by the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, a very important 18th century Italian Jewish thinker, but certainly has deep roots as a kind of core triad within Jewish thinking and Jewish life. So what we're going to do this evening is I'm going to ask a couple of questions about his introduction, and then we're going to ask one or two questions about each of those three sections of the book, and the book really follows along in that order of God, Torah, and Israel. So let me start, Art, with your introduction, which begins very personally about your own religious journey. And I would love for you to share with us a little bit about the highlights of that journey, which are particularly pertinent to your writing this book. And in particular, you point out that Jewish mysticism, which is a focus of this book, Jewish mysticism for a contemporary age, how Jewish mysticism actually saved Judaism for you as a younger man, and what you meant by that.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here. Nice to share this evening with you. Well, it's a long story. I'll try to tell it briefly. Like many people, I am a product of two families. My father was a militant atheist, a rationalist, a skeptic, trained me to think critically. Dad was a high school teacher in Newark, New Jersey, but had it not been for the Depression, he always said he really would have had an academic career. And my mother's parents were old world, old-fashioned Jews, not Orthodox. Grandpa's tailor shop was open on Shabbos, but once he retired, he started going to shul every Shabbos and then every day. It may have been schnapps and herring as much as davening, but he was of that world. And I was very much attracted to that world as a child. I don't know why, but when I was 8 or 9 years old, I was already dragging my mother to synagogue on Friday nights. I was given a Jewish education because my mother's mother was a tough lady and there had to be a bar mitzvah for every boy. My sister got not a day of Jewish education because there was no such demand. And Dad grudgingly let me go, and I, maybe despite him, took to it like a duck to water. I am a rare duck in that I am a positive product of the afternoon Hebrew schools.
Me too.
Right, here we are, not day school kids. But when I was 12 or so, a Hebrew teacher of mine shipped me off to Ramah, and I came out of Hebrew high school 3 afternoons a week and Ramah with pretty good Hebrew, and just loved it. And it was, I guess you'd have to say, much more attractive and much more profound than my public school education. When I was 15 and 16, I was in Camp Ramah in the Poconos. I had these wonderful teachers who were later famous seminary professors. I read Heschel when I was 15 and fell in love, and I was very attracted to it, and I was, to my father's terrible consternation, coming closer and closer to orthodoxy. By the time I was a freshman at Brandeis, I was fully observant, I would say. We had a dynamic young Hillel director at Brandeis my freshman year who only lasted 1 year there. His name was Yitz Greenberg. And he was a very big influence, I think. And I was moving toward, I would say, identifying myself as Orthodox, having come sort of out of the conservative world. I was, like many young people today, moving toward the right. When I was 18 years old, I stopped. I just realized that I had been fooling myself, that I didn't believe in what underlay, in the theology that underlay all this observance, that I had been avoiding all kinds of personal issues. I had spent much of adolescence mourning and dealing with my mother's death. She died when I was 11, and God in some ways was a refuge from that. And all kinds of other things felt like they were, religion was a way to avoid lots of personal growth issues. And on the eve of my 18th birthday, I went out to a diner in Waltham and ate 2 Treif hamburgers, and that was it. I thought after the first hamburger I might have repented, but once it was 2. And I then spent 2 years or so really struggling for a secular Jewish identity because I was very strongly involved in Jewish life. I was a Jewish studies major. My love of Hebrew had not gone anywhere. I was also falling in love with Yiddish at that time. Yiddish was taught for the first time at Brandeis, and I was one of the first students. And then Professor Altman came to Brandeis from England in my junior year, I think, and taught the first course ever in an American university on Jewish mysticism, and I was utterly enthralled by it. it seemed to me, again, to recapture some of the profundity without the simplistic faith beliefs. It was more about the transformation of the inner self than it was about believing in the old fellow who had written the book and given it to us. There somehow seemed to be a different level of mental activity that was being called for, something like that. When I was a senior in college, and I was, as I say, I was trying on secular Jewish identity. I was chairman of the Zionist organization, and I was going to Yiddish meetings and trying to find another way to be Jewish. But I came to understand, I think, that even though I was not a believer, I was still a religious person. That's what I say in the introduction. Nachum Glatzer was teaching Buber and Rosenzweig at Brandeis, and Buber spoke to me very deeply. When I was a senior in college, somebody, maybe Zalman Schachter, maybe Altman, gave me an essay by Hillel Zeitlin, a Hebrew essay on the fundaments of Hasidism, and that somehow spoke to me very powerfully. And by the time I graduated college, I knew that I was going to spend my life involved with the Jewish mystical tradition. I went off to Israel for a year right after college to study with Sholem. It was clear to me that that's who I was. And that all happened somehow in the year after that, in the year or two after that rebellion against conventional Judaism.
And you mentioned in the introduction the profound influence that Abraham Joshua Heschel, when you studied with him at the Jewish Theological Seminary, had on you. I'm curious if you can imagine, since you state in your introduction that even the title of your book, Radical Judaism, echoes some of the radical theology that Heschel wrote. Can you imagine what Heschel might think of this book?
Ooh. Well, I have to tell you, in 1966, I was a rabbinical student, and Richard Rubinstein published After Auschwitz. You could not mention Rubinstein's name in Heschel's presence. He was a Talmid Shesarach. He was a student who went bad, and he had blasphemed by saying God is dead, and therefore you may not mention his name. Heschel was very severe. He felt betrayed by Rubinstein. Rubinstein had been his student. Rubinstein was one of two people who followed him from Cincinnati to New York.
Oh, I didn't know.
And he felt betrayed when Rubinstein came out with his theology. So I don't know. I remember writing a paper for Heschel as a student on the possibility of petitionary prayer, and Heschel was very unhappy with it because I was more of a questioner. Even then, I was always somewhat to the left of Heschel, you might say. As I came back into theology, it was really through the door of Kabbalah, and Kabbalah told me that the personal God, the personal figure of God, that is to say, God as a human-like personality, was a construct, that the ultimate God was mystery. And it was the mystery that attracted me. Heschel was really a personalist, that God is a person who cares about you in a Hatzadika kind of personal way, was the essence in some ways of Heschel's piety. I'm looking at my friend Ed Kaplan as I say that. That was essential. That pathos was essential to his piety. It had mystical overtones, but that was the center. For me, the mystical is the center, and I use that language. I still use traditional Jewish language, but we're not the same. So you'll see me in footnotes arguing with Heschel over the course of the book. He died in 1972, and I'm still having the conversation with him, and this book, in some ways, is an extended conversation.
And I'm going to come back to that question of the mystical in contrast to the personal, the mystery versus the personality of God in just a few minutes, because that's one thing I want to explore with you. In what ways is this book radical? You chose the title Radical Judaism, and you again referenced radical theology. What is radical about this?
First, I'm going to say something about the word. Some people have looked at the book and said, "Oh, is that like radical Islam?" The meaning of the word radical seems to have shifted in our consciousness. You see, that goes back I have to do Heschel again. That goes back to a conversation with Heschel. Heschel was so admired by us students because of his ethical stances, because of being the friend of Martin Luther King and marching in Selma and being a leader in the anti-war movement in the 60s. Those of you who remember those days will remember it. But theologically, Heschel was pretty conservative. It felt a little pie in the sky to us sometimes. How could a man whose mother and sisters had died in the Warsaw Ghetto say such things about how beautiful life is? It just felt sometimes frustrating to us. So one day in 1966, as a brash 25-year-old rabbinical student, I walked into Heschel's office and said, "Professor Heschel, what do you think about radical theology?" And he said to me, "Radical theology is very important, Arthur," he said, but it has to begin, and he mentioned the names of two Hasidic masters. It has to begin with the later Hasidic masters. They are very radical. And I knew what he meant and have gone in that direction. Posing basic questions, going back to the root, asking what's the real root? And the real root is in God and in the mystery. The real root, it's the source beyond the sources, if you want to say it that way. It's being willing to ask the big questions. Is there a God who in some personal way cares that we do observances this way or that way? And if not, what's it all about? How do we reestablish a foundation for Jewish life? Let me say it this way, and I may be jumping the gun on something you're going to ask. Traditional religion fought two great battles in the 20th century. The battle against evolution and the battle against biblical criticism. It lost them both. And those battles, in some way, those issues in some ways are decided in the minds of thinking people. But religion hasn't gone away. Religion isn't defeated. Religion is more important than ever. But how do we honestly reestablish a basis for religion, accepting the conclusions of those two struggles, of those two defeats?
And that is a good bridge to my next question, which centers on the part of the book that deals with God, this first section. You start that section with what seems a very important theme in this book. And I'm going to quote, "The evolution of species is the greatest sacred drama of all time." So you place a great emphasis, especially in the section about God, in trying to understand the place evolution should play in this reconstruction, in this reestablishment of religion in the 21st century, this postmodern stance. And I'm wondering how evolution, which seems to me to be a very impersonal process, doesn't really care much about me as an individual. And in fact, the role that I play in the evolutionary drama is very, very hard to capture and understand. How can you make that huge, mysterious, larger-than-life process a central feature of the concept of God in people's everyday lives?
God is larger than life. It has to be larger than life. That's the point. I think rather than fight evolution or struggle against evolution or say, oh, but they haven't found this particular link, therefore it's still just a theory, I think that's all nonsense.
But you can still very much be committed to evolution as a scientific theory without making it the centerpiece of your theology.
So what I think we have to do as religious people is rather embrace it and in some ways transform it, make it our own. Because, and here, Heschel's call for radical amazement, Heschel's call for seeing the world through the eyes of wonder, that to me is what I want to do with evolution. Not fight it, not deny it, but open our eyes to it and see how magnificent it is, how wondrous it is. And to me that allows me to see it as sort of brimming over with divine presence, as filled with a Shekhinah, as filled with the presence of God. It is, as I say, in a completely natural way, I understand it to be miraculous. That is to say, overwhelmingly powerful and beautiful and calling on me to respond to it somehow. And that to me is it's a religious event. Now, the place you or I have in that evolutionary drama is obviously tiny. It's obviously each of us is here for a split second. But I've come to understand in this sort of poetic reading of evolution that the one energy that enters into each of these forms, in that moment that it lives in that form, it delights in that form. It's fully present in that form. Now, delights is a pretty anthropomorphic word, and I know that. But it's also a word that comes from light, after all, and it shines into that form. And that shining is a kind of this manifesting energy has chosen to enter that form at that time, whether it's that flower or that bee or that human being, speaking now not just of people. It has chosen to be in that form at that time, and that's why that form has come into being, and therefore the fullness of divine energy, or the fullness of the oneness of being, or whatever you want to call it, is in that form. But for humans, I think I understand that we are called upon to participate actively in that evolutionary process. I feel the evolutionary process sort of calling to me and say, well, what are you doing to push this forward? How are you moving it?
But do you really think that evolution, this is somewhere I got stuck. Does evolution really care? In other words, does it have any impact on the evolutionary process moving forward, what I do, what I think, what concerns me? I mean, the question of how religion is supposed to create a world of meaning for me as an individual or for even a community, it's hard for me to understand how thinking about that evolutionary process provides any meaningful understanding of an individual life.
Well, does it care for you in the sense that it takes care? No. That is to say, in my struggle with traditional religion, I had to realize very early that that death and suffering are arbitrary, and there is no reward for the righteous or punishment for the wicked. I just stepped beyond that, and I had to have a religion that wasn't about that. That was almost a beginning point for me, realizing that I'm not kidding myself, and that was when I left religion at age 18 and said I'd been kidding myself. I knew I couldn't go back to playing that game. So accepting a certain coldness and arbitrariness of life as a reality, I still find that there is a call to stretch your mind, to think, to push the process forward, to think more about that oneness of being, to advance the enterprise of human development, and that somehow is becoming an active partner, an active participant in that evolutionary world, but without delusion, without illusions, without kidding myself and saying, no, it cares about me in a personal way, because I know it doesn't.
So if you take evolution and the amazement, the wonder about evolution so seriously, you're the rector of our rabbinical school. Would you in fact recommend moving forward that we incorporate into our curriculum some serious exploration, study, and discovery of science, in a intense, rigorous way? Because how can we deny our students the model of serious attention to evolution in its various forms as a part of rabbinical training?
I think it's a good idea. I also know that when you talk about curriculum, everything is competing with everything else. So what will we study less of in order to study more of that? And that question is always on the table. Sharon and I sort of live on the cutting floor of what it's like to put an education together. But yes, I think so. I would love to train rabbis who have a greater awareness of the environment. I think that environmental crisis is going to be the great issue of the 21st century. I think we are living in a fool's paradise right now. We keep putting off what we need to do, and governments keep acting irresponsibly. I'm a very disappointed Democrat that nothing on the environmental front has happened in this cycle, and I think there will be a big price to pay. And I think 50 years from now, the most important task of religion will be helping people adjust to the tremendous changes in lifestyle we're going to have to undergo in order to survive as a species and a planet. And having rabbis who are prepared to help Jews and others move in that direction, I think would be a good thing. So bring it on, but we have to we have to think, of course, are there jobs for environmental rabbis? Are there careers yet? And all those things are also on the table.
One more question in this God section. You refer to a concept, a word, in fact, that is important in describing certain elements of Hasidic thought and that you take quite seriously as the basis of your own theological thinking, panentheism. And I would like you to talk a little bit about that word and what it means and how you you use it. And along with that, your discomfort, which comes through very clearly to me in this section, with God as other, which has been a critical component of many classical religions, and how the concept of panentheism addresses and understands God in a way other than the otherness.
Other than other. Yes, that's a key. This is key stuff. Pantheism, of course, means that all is God. There is no distinction between God and the world. Panentheism, a term created sort of in the early 20th century, Hartshorne and others, panentheism means all things contain the presence of God, all things contain God, God is in all things, but the sum is more than the whole is more than the sum of its parts. In other words, there is a mysterious wholeness that is not there if you add up all the things in the universe that contain this divine energy. When you consider them as one, when you say Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad in Jewish language, you're still talking about something transcendent. Now, usually people talk about two poles in Jewish theology. Immanent means God is inside, is within the world, dwells in things, and transcendent means God dwells beyond, out there, above. I don't know an above. I don't know a place on the other side of the sky where God lives. I don't think there is an edge to the universe that God lives outside. So for me, transcendence is there, but transcendence lives inside the immanence, which is to say God is here in such an intense way that we can never fathom it, and that remains transcendent. That's what transcendence is to me. So there is something unknown, unattainable, but it's not somebody out there. It is the depth of the mystery. That's what I mean by panentheism. It is, Zeitlin talks about the Baal Shem Tov's pantheism as distinct from Spinoza's, because Spinoza's is ultimately reductionist. If all things are God, then talk about God essentially becomes meaningless in a certain way, whereas for the Baal Shem Tov there is always the mystery beyond. And that sense of mystery beyond is key to me.
And why this rejection of the otherness of God?
Maybe because the other often becomes an oppressive other, and became an oppressive other in my earlier religious life. I think that agenda is probably still there. If you scratch the psychological surface, you'll probably find it there.
But you make reference to Levinas, who really uses the other as the opposite, as the object of that ethical demand on us.
Yes, I make negative reference to Levinas. Yes. I disagree with Levinas. Because the ultimate truth, it seems to me, is oneness. That oneness of being is something I feel in a kind of instinctive way. That's very important. I am in some ways naturally drawn to mysticism because I feel a kind of inner oneness of being. I say somewhere, not in here, but it says somewhere else I wrote, is it because I was some kind of weird child who in Piaget's early stages couldn't decide where I ended and where my mother began or something like that? Are there people who have a natural attraction to that kind of oneness, and can you explain it in sort of Freudian terms? But if I'm going to look for a language to explain it, then I prefer, in some ways, Kabbalistic language to Freudian language. There's a certain kind of, to quote a teacher of yours, kol dodi dofek, there are people who seem to live with a certain greater openness to that in a natural way, and feel that presence of the open door.
Yeah, it's interesting because I struggle a great deal with what I perceive to be a very different sensibility that I have, which is in fact that the otherness is the most basic reality, in fact, and that the monism, the sense of the oneness that you feel so strongly, for me, it's much more natural to see the multiplicity and the diversity and see that somehow. And the oneness, for me, is much more about the holding of this incredible diversity and multiplicity, and not that which runs through it as some kind of common being.
I think there is some psychological tendency there. I fully admit to it.
Yeah. No, and it's just interesting because it's this whole mystical element is so challenging to me. Let me move to the Torah section, and you certainly clearly admit the human authorship of the Torah and move far away from the classical sense of Torah as some God-given text. And I think we all can feel comfortable, at least with that modern sensibility. When it comes to the concept of mitzvah, of commandment, which is a central theme in Torah, you distinguish yourself in your thinking from Mordechai Kaplan by saying mitzvah is more than a custom, not merely a folkway.
That's a direct poke
right,
at Kaplan,
which is Kaplan's language.
Right.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you do understand the concept of mitzvah, and what is the divine command that we are called to respond to?
Called to respond to, that's exactly the right phrase, that's what I'm saying. Because I see that to be a religious person, you in some ways have to personify this force of being, or this oneness of the universe, or this evolutionary energy that I feel surging through us. Because to me, a religious response to that inner self, to that oneness of being, is to feel it calls upon us. It calls upon us to do something. It calls upon us to act in a certain way. It calls upon us to know it. It longs to be known somehow, to become manifest in us, for us to become aware of it. Now, awareness, it seems to me, awareness is the key word
So
there.
evolution wants us to be aware of it.
Evolution wants us to be aware of it, yes. It has evolved into aware beings because those beings are channels of that awareness, are possible channels of that awareness who will help move that process further into evolutionary directions we don't know yet, of course. We are not the end of evolution. This is still going on. So it calls upon us to be aware. And it calls upon us to share that awareness with one another. Because it doesn't want me to be aware, it wants us collectively to be aware. So how do we do that? We are very busy human beings. We're very busy surviving. We're very busy with our ego journeys and with our toy collecting and all the things we do in the course of our lives. And so human societies create religions that have series of reminders, reminding us to be aware. So much of the tradition, Shabbat, Tefillin, Mezuzah, all those things that are ot, that sense of ot to me is a signs, reminder to be aware. You live this way, you do these things, you eat this way, you live in this rhythm, because it reminds you of this essential call to you to be aware and to act in an aware way. And then a mitzvah becomes an opportunity to do that, becomes an opportunity to express that awareness.
And what about ethical mitzvot? The responsibility
Yes.
and the call to be ethical.
Well, we are part of that one with one another. We are there in a sense all part of the same body. We are limbs in the same great body of existence. And so therefore harming the other is in some ways harming another piece of our own self. So I had lots of fights along the way. I used to say there were three people who always stood up every time we talked about, Larry Kushner and I used to talk about the renewal of Jewish spirituality. And it would be Arnold Jacob Wolf and Stephen Schwarzschild, Alea Mashalom, now it's two ghosts, I'm afraid, and Gene Borowitz. All three of them of that generation stood up and said, no, that will lead you to moral irresponsibility because you will neglect the other. If you're busy embracing the oneness of being, you won't take the other seriously. And you need a neo-Kantian ethic. You need something outside you to be the commander. And if the commander is within and you're all one, then is there a commander anymore? And I insisted, no, if you're all one, then you won't want to harm yourself. Then there is a different kind of imperative. There is an imperative of a shared inhabiting of the same one extended being that also commands.
Right, and the question
This is an old conversation, as you say.
No, but the question of the awareness and focus on that oneness does allow you to make the kinds of difficult choices and decisions that are often involved in ethical action, where it's, the oneness tends to make it very problematic to decide this way or that.
Yes,
for all one.
to fight a war. I understand.
Right.
I understand.
So it's a challenge. One more question in this section, and that's, you make an argument here about the sacred nature of Torah and what makes it something that contemporary Jews, as a tradition, as a text, as an ongoing interpretive process, should take seriously. And I'm wondering if you think the Torah, and let's take the Tanakh, the Bible, as an example, is a text that can continue, given the shifting landscape that we've experienced in this century, to capture people's imaginations. I mean, is it a narrative and a poetic and legal document that is best suited to communicate some of these basic theological concepts to Jews and other peoples today?
It's a very big effort. It's a very big effort to reinterpret Torah constantly. Now, the truth is the Rambam and the Kabbalists had the same problem in a certain way. It's not a new problem. This is a very old text. There are things in the text that infuriate me. As you know, there are some places in the text where I have trouble getting up for an aliyah and saying Notena Torah, and then having somebody read the passage where Moses says, go back and kill the women and children. You forgot to kill the women and children. And then what does it mean, Asher Natan Lanu Torah Temet, in that moment? God gives us Torah of truth in that moment. It's very hard. Those are the super painful ones. But the antiquity of it is also its power and its beauty to me. The essential narrative, the Torah text narrative, is a narrative to which I feel deeply wedded. I mean, I've lived as a Jew for lots of years now, and read interpretations and preached on and talked about the Parsha for a long time, and somehow we have made it, over the course of the centuries, a very humanizing document. I think the tremendous rebirth of Midrash that's happened in the last 40 years, Chavurah movement, Jewish feminist movement, and so on, has been very important. If we were back where we were in the 1960s, talking about critical study is the most important thing, the critical Bible, I would be bored. I would have said, let's get beyond that already. But the reopening of Midrash, saying that Avraham Avinu is really the primal seeker for you, and the struggles of Joseph and his brothers is really a place to deal with what it means to be a brother and what it means to live family, and the journey of the Exodus, the journey through the wilderness and so on. These are such powerful symbols that I find in a broad sense they work. Sometimes you have to engage in all the devices the Kabbalists used and more to drudge meaning out of a passage, and sometimes it's very frustrating, and I say, the Zohar already says in the 13th century, why couldn't we write a better one? But I don't begin to have that kind of chutzpah. And the Zohar didn't either in the end.
Not that radical.
They said if the Torah is only a storybook, we could write a better one, therefore it must be something more, and I still believe in that.
So let me turn, and I'm going to finish up in the next 10 minutes and then open it up. Let me turn to the last section, which deals with Israel. And you have a phrase here in discussing Israel as a name for the Jewish community and Jewish identity. You have a paragraph here that really caused me to pause in thinking about the contemporary reality of 21st century Judaism, especially as we experience it even within our own rabbinical school. You say that this Israel includes many with whom I feel little in common. Our views, religious, political, social, may be deeply in conflict. But we all know that we are Israel. We know it in the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and we knew it in the days before the 1967 Six-Day War, and again in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. We know we were all Israel because of the Holocaust, because of the Nuremberg law that required every Jewish male to take the name Israel as a middle name in order to distinguish us from the Aryan population. We bear it with pride. Is that still ring true to young Jews today? Do they still have that visceral sense that we are Israel and that there's a kind of natural understanding and acceptance of that identity?
You're asking an old Jew.
But you're writing radical Judaism for the 21st postmodern century.
Right. I want them to. But listen, for people of my daughter's generation, my daughter was born in 1976. She's an aging young person already. For them, the Holocaust is ancient history. 1967 happened before they were born. And the memories that so characterize my generation, I think I say in the introduction, I remember my mother and grandmother going through the newspapers relatives sought after the war. Grandma never learned to read English, and in the English paper, my mother would go through the lists with her looking for, there was one cousin left in Poland, I think, in the family whom she was especially concerned with. And those are searing memories. I am of the generation that was brought up with great awareness of the Holocaust and great awareness of refugees. DPs were names that we knew, things that we cared about what was going to happen to the refugees, and the miracle of what Israel did for the rescue of the Jewish people after the war. That's all very much a part of my consciousness. I was very involved in the 60s and early 70s in the Soviet Jewry movement in its early days when I was a rabbinical student, and so on, because of that. But
how do we engage other people?
For young people who have been brought up on post-1967 Israel with all the problems, moral problems, political problems, and so on in that society, and without that sense of the essential nature and the joy of kibbutz galuyot and of the experience of Israel, it is indeed very hard. So I think we have to work to change some policies that would make us prouder of what's going on in the Jewish people. But I also think that we have to engage people in the enterprise of Jewish peoplehood. And Jewish peoplehood to me does not mean only Zionism. I'm really a Shimon Ravidovich disciple fully, believing that the two centers, Bavel and Yerushalayim, or diaspora creativity and Israel creativity, need one another and need to nourish one another. And therefore the way we learn from one another should be more mutualized and so on. But I think, yes, engaging in the enterprise call, there is a Jewish people. This Jewish people is a covenanted people, has a sacred task and so on. It's a religious language, but it's a religious language built on a foundation of we are Amcha Yisrael, we are Yisrael Amecha.
So I want to pick up on that because this is another area where I think you sharply differ with Mordecai Kaplan's thought. This covenantal people seems to me to echo the idea of chosenness, even though it's obviously not in the sense of divine election, but there is a sense of the special sacred task calling of the Jewish people. Do you affirm that?
Yes, I affirm it. I think we chose. I think the covenant was our idea. We created it. I don't think God came out of the heavens and said, I choose you. I think we chose. But I feel still committed to that choice. We were forged in this experience we call Sinai. Whether Sinai happened at once or Sinai happened over 100 years, I'm not worried about. But I think somehow we declared ourselves that we were going to be a nation of priests in a holy community, and we were going to do that, and that meant we had an obligation to make people aware of the oneness of being and to live a kind of morally exemplary life as a community. And I think we still are called to that. And I think Jews, many young Jews, still believe that, Danny. I think many young Jews still believe that. Even if they don't believe in God and don't believe in the Jewish people, the presence of Jews in the leadership of every human rights and civil rights organization in the world has something to do with understanding that we were slaves in Egypt, and something to do with understanding of the image of God, that Judaism says humans' creation in the image of God is central. I think that sense of a Jew should know better. A Jew shouldn't do that. There are things a Jew just doesn't do because of the Jewish experience.